Sup chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So at this point, Bryan Johnson is the most famous health influencer in the entire world. Literally everybody has heard of him. If you were to go to some remote tribe that has no contact with civilization, like the Sentinelese people in India, there is a good chance that even they are familiar with Bryan Johnson. No hate, of course, because I like the man, and I am glad to see he's been very successful in raising awareness about extending the human lifespan, which is a very important subject. After all, life is too short, and the world would be a much better place if people could live longer, since people would care more about the future if they knew they were going to live long enough to actually see it. So, if you guys remember my previous video on Bryan Johnson, I went over 7 clinically proven methods to extend the human lifespan based on our current day understanding of human physiology. In that video, which I'll link below, I talked about 3 types of aging. I mentioned chronological age, which refers to the passing of time, biological age, which describes how much the passage of time has affected an individual's biology, and finally, there is perceived age, which refers to what age people appear to be. Fighting hair loss is part of the broader subject of anti-aging, and it fits within the perceived aging subcategory since going bald will make you look much older. So, being that Bryan Johnson wants to live forever and also look young forever, fighting hair loss is naturally something that is very important to him, as well as to many other people, of course. So, not surprisingly, Bryan Johnson's daily anti-aging routine includes protocols to stop and reverse hair loss, and some of the products he uses includes things that he's made commercially available on his Blueprint website, including a peptide hair loss serum and a peptide shampoo. Now, at first, I was a little skeptical that this was actually something Bryan Johnson himself was using, so I went ahead and went to the Bryan Johnson website and asked that question in the chat window on the website, and indeed, the person I chatted with confirmed that Bryan Johnson does actually use these products. So, I guess it helps to be a Sentai millionaire like Bryan Johnson because these products aren't cheap. A month's supply of his shampoo plus his hair serum costs 182 British pounds, which is about $245 US. And before you ask, no. I have no idea why the price shows up on my web browser in British pounds, but that's pretty strange. But that's not all Bryan Johnson uses on his hair, and the gentleman I chatted with kindly referred me to a recent YouTube video that Mr. Johnson made about his daily routine. Only the beginning of the video has to do with his hair care routine, but as someone who is interested in both hair care and Bryan Johnson, I thought I should go over the pros and cons of Bryan Johnson's current hair loss routine, and maybe add some of my own recommendations too.
I am. Wakey, wakey.
I promise that's going to be the only time I do this in the video, chums.
What the f?
Hey, you're late!
Well, he starts off talking about biomarkers, but let's go ahead and skip ahead to his hair loss stack.
Before going to bed last night, I applied a hair serum, which is tailored to my genetics.
So this is interesting, because his first hair loss topical is a formulation that he's not selling on his website. Maybe that's because if he were, it would probably cost 500 British pounds and no one would be able to actually afford it. Anyways, this topical, which he calls his custom hair serum, has a whole bunch of different compounds in it, but clearly the key ingredient of importance here is minoxidil. So right away, we know for certain that Bryan Johnson is definitely using at least one thing that has been clinically proven to work for hair loss. That's great for him, of course, but that's a problem when it comes to anything else he's using, because now we don't know if any of the additional ingredients in his hair products are adding to the results or if it's just from minoxidil alone. He has all these other compounds in this custom topical, but for all we know, his gains are from minoxidil alone, especially since he's using it with 0.0125% tretinoin, which we know can potentiate minoxidil's efficacy by upregulating the sulfotransferase enzyme, which converts minoxidil into its active form called minoxidil sulfate. And I did a video explaining tretinoin's benefits as a hair loss adjunctive treatment in a video which I'll link below. Also, notice that the concentration of minoxidil in the custom serum is 7%. So, why did Bryan Johnson pick 7% for his topical? Why not just the standard 5% concentration or a higher concentration like 10 or 15%? Well, even though studies clearly show that 5% minoxidil is superior to 2% minoxidil, the results with 10 or 15% minoxidil have not been consistent. In fact, one randomized trial showed that 10% was even inferior to 5% minoxidil. Now, I don't know Bryan Johnson personally, although I wish I did because he seems like a really cool and interesting guy, but I think I've followed him long enough to know how he thinks. I'm sure he chose 7% minoxidil because the maximum solubility of minoxidil in propylene glycol is 7.5%. If you have concentrations of minoxidil above 7.5%, the minoxidil crystallizes and so it can't be absorbed into the scalp. This is probably why the results with 10% and 15% minoxidil haven't been that good, and I'm sure Bryan Johnson chose a 7% concentration, even though 7% has never been tested in a clinical study to my knowledge, because 7% is the maximum concentration of minoxidil that won't crystallize. Now, he does have dutasteride in the compound at a concentration of 0.25%, but he doesn't mention if this dutasteride uses any special delivery system to increase its absorption. Dutasteride, it's important to remember, has a larger molecular weight of 528 grams per mole, and molecules larger than 500 grams per mole have a difficult time penetrating the skin. That's known as the 500 Dalton rule. So, early preparations of dutasteride that were sold online were pretty ineffective, but newer preparations use nanoparticles or special liposomes to increase absorption through the skin of the dutasteride, such as the preparations made by the company Zion. Although, whether or not the Zion solution actually works isn't known because the study only had like 10 subjects and it didn't even measure hair counts. There's also another patented formulation of topical dutasteride that is dissolved in alcohol and includes medium-chain triglycerides and castor oil, and I just did a video about that which I'll link below. But Bryan Johnson doesn't mention if there is anything special about his dutasteride preparation or whether it is just pure dutasteride dissolved in propylene glycol. So it's hard to know how much of the topical dutasteride in this formula is actually being absorbed. But if Bryan Johnson wants to use a 5-AR inhibitor topically, then he should be using topical finasteride because that can easily penetrate the skin since it falls well below the 500 Dalton threshold for skin penetration. Or better yet, Bryan Johnson should just be using oral finasteride since finasteride has many of the longevity benefits that Bryan Johnson is so desperately seeking, such as improving cardiovascular health, skin health, and even reducing the risk of certain types of cancers. I even mentioned 5-AR inhibitors like finasteride in my top 7 longevity treatments videos, which I'll link below. But the bottom line is that 5-AR inhibitors have many fantastic health and longevity benefits that extend well beyond hair loss, so Bryan Johnson should absolutely be taking these wonderful drugs orally if he wants to get the full benefits from them. I actually have several videos on that topic and I'll link them below. But as far as I know, Bryan Johnson does not take an oral 5-AR inhibitor, even though he should. The last time I heard him talk about that, I think he was afraid of getting sexual side effects, but I think he's being way too paranoid here. Also, even topical 5-AR blockers absorb systemically, so he's not completely avoiding the potential problems by using topical dutasteride. I believe he did take oral finasteride at some point in the past, which is probably why he did regrow a lot of his hair. However, I am a little suspicious of these before and after photos. They are taken with the same background and with his head tilted the same way. Also, his face doesn't look as chubby as he looks in older photos before he started his quest for longevity. His older photos show some hair loss, but not as severe as the before and after photos. So I don't know if these kinds of photos are him just trying to hype up the effectiveness of his hair loss serums, but let's go ahead and move on.
Now I apply my custom 8-ingredient blueprint hair serum to support hair growth and scalp health.
So now he's using the product he's actually selling on his website. It's his Blueprint Hair Serum, but like I said earlier, it is impossible to determine how effective this serum is for Bryan Johnson since he's using it in conjunction with a product that he doesn't sell that contains minoxidil, which is a clinically proven ingredient. So we know it works, and his custom topical also contains topical dutasteride, which may or may not be working for him too. If he used this Blueprint Hair Serum by itself and got good results, then we could at least conclude that Bryan Johnson represents a good case study for his product, but what we really need here is some clinical evidence involving multiple subjects that includes proper controls. But what Bryan Johnson likes to do often is he searches the medical literature to find any compounds that have even the tiniest bit of evidence for their efficacy, and then he likes to combine them all together in a blender. So I'd like to concentrate on what evidence there is for using his hair serum, and we'll get into that in a moment, but let's first see what Bryan Johnson is also using for his hair loss.
These ingredients only need a few minutes to take effect, so I'll wash them out shortly with a Blueprint Peptide shampoo.
So he briefly mentions the shampoo that he also sells on his website, but doesn't really say anything more about it or make any claims that it stimulates hair growth, so I'll skip it, but I will point out that it too is very expensive, although it probably is a very high quality shampoo.
5% minoxidil applied daily is a great budget alternative for hair growth.
I agree with him. Just using 5% topical minoxidil is a lot cheaper and it's proven to work. So why would anyone choose this topical over just plain old generic minoxidil? Also, I'm not sure if he is saying that generic minoxidil is a good alternative to the Blueprint serum on sale on his website or to this custom serum that isn't on sale, or both of them. In fact, almost certainly generic minoxidil would be superior to the hair serum he sells on his website in a side-by-side comparison, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. For now, let's allow Bryan Johnson to continue his morning routine.
I use a silicone scalp scrubber to stimulate circulation and gently exfoliate my scalp.
Bryan, what are you doing here, man? Don't you have a team of researchers working with you and consulting with you on your routine? If so, then you should know that circulation does not play a role in hair loss, and even if it did, circulation is not impaired in the scalp to begin with. All you need to do to see this is look at any vascular anatomy chart of the scalp. If you see this, you can clearly see that the major blood vessels that supply blood to the scalp and the hair follicles do not run under the scalp muscles or connective tissues like the Gallia appeneurotica. They run above it. So there are no impediments to the circulation of the scalp, and even if there were, rubbing the scalp wouldn't do anything. The scalp is literally the most vascular region of the body. Not only is it highly vascular, but the vascular network that supports the scalp has a lot of built-in redundancy to prevent impediments to circulation. So what I mean by that is that all the major arteries that supply blood to the scalp are interconnected. So even if one or several of the arteries were impeded, it would just increase the circulation of the other arteries. So the overall blood supply to the scalp would not be changed. It wouldn't affect the hair in any way whatsoever. In fact, you don't even have to take my word for it, and that's because there is a popular cosmetic surgery where people will ligate the superficial temporal artery, which means to cut it off completely. The reason they do that is because for some people, the artery is easily visible underneath the skin of the forehead, and some people don't like the way it looks. Surgeons who perform the surgery have shown that this procedure does not cause hair loss even though you are obliterating one of the major scalp arteries. Now, some people will point out that bald men have less blood in their scalp than men with hair, but it turns out that this is a consequence of balding, not a cause. You see, when hair follicles die, DHT will kill capillaries that support the hair follicles. So when the hair follicles go, the microvascular structures that support the hair follicles will also go away. But in terms of the macrovascular structure of the scalp, that will always stay the same, and there's no special type of massage tool or instrument that can ever change that. So, sorry I had to spend so much time on such a small segment of the video, but there is a huge amount of misinformation about hair circulation and hair loss. But just know for certain that all the theories about the Gallia appeneurotica, scalp tension, and blood flow are all completely false. And I made an entire playlist debunking this obsolete and annoying theory, so make sure you check it out if you want more information about that. It's possible the only thing this scalp massaging device does is help spread his topical more evenly and helps improve the absorption into the skin, or maybe just likes the tingly feeling he gets from it.
I then use a Blueprint red light laser cap to enhance absorption and make sure the ingredients reach the right receptors along the follicle. A recent study showed that using a laser cap for 25 minutes every other day for 16 weeks gave a 39% increase in hair growth.
So he also uses a laser cap, but he says something about it which is pretty interesting because I've never heard anyone else say it before. He says he uses it to better distribute the ingredients of his topical and to make sure the ingredients of his hair serum reach the right receptors along the follicles. Laser therapy for hair loss, also known as LLLT, is a common treatment that has been around for a while now, but I don't think I've ever heard of any laser device being used to distribute a hair serum, and I don't see how light applied to the scalp could help with this anyways. So I don't know what research Bryan Johnson saw that convinced him that a laser hat would be useful for this purpose. Are laser devices completely useless? Well, no. Not completely. There are some small studies suggesting that it has benefits, but there are also studies like this one that showed no benefit over topical minoxidil alone when laser therapy was added to the minoxidil. However, he quotes a new study that shows that there is a 39% improvement in scalp hair with regular use of a laser cap. Here's the study. So, this is yet another very small study of 44 men with androgenic alopecia who received laser light treatment using a helmet or a sham treatment using an identical appearing helmet that just glowed with non-laser red lights. The men wore the cap for 25 minutes every other day for a total of 16 weeks. The study was done at 2 study sites, and one of the problems with the study is that there was a large variation in the baseline hair counts between the 2 sites and between the active and treatment groups. The authors ended up analyzing the data after throwing out one outlier subject in the control group who had a large decrease in hair counts. The researchers found that overall, the average increase in hair counts in the treatment group was 67%, but there was also a 32% average increase in hair counts in the control group. So in the conclusions of the study, the authors actually claimed there was a 35% increase in hair counts, which is 67 minus 32, rather than the 39% increase that Bryan Johnson showed in the video. The 39% increase was the percentage you get if you included the one control subject that was thrown out of the study. But it really doesn't matter too much. This is yet another small study that was actually sponsored by the maker of the laser helmet. It's not a definitive study by any means. So unfortunately, there is still not enough high-quality research on laser light treatment to recommend it for everyone. Also, these laser devices can be prohibitively expensive, with some costing thousands of dollars. Apparently, the Blueprint laser cap is not available yet, but it will also be very expensive at 1,074 pounds, which today is 1,450 US dollars. Of course, that's obviously not a problem for Bryan Johnson, since he is a centimillionaire and the God Emperor of Arrakis. But for your average Fremen peasant, there are much better options than a laser helmet. So that's pretty much it for his routine as it relates to hair loss, but I would like to get back to his hair growth serum because that's not just something he's using, it's also something he's selling. So I want to know if this is the right type of product that people who follow Bryan Johnson should be using if they want to maximize the longevity of their hair follicles. Here are the ingredients of the hair growth serum. First, there is something called Peptide Complex 8. I have no idea what this is, but Bryan Johnson claims it supports the appearance of fuller, thicker hair, so it may be some kind of conditioner, I don't know. He's not claiming this stuff actually regrows hair, and actually, he's not making that claim for any of the ingredients in his product. Next up, we have PDGF plus EGF. PDGF is a platelet-derived growth factor, and EGF is epidermal growth factor. The research on PDGF and EGF is very preliminary. It's based on studies using cell cultures and using mice subjects. Both these substances play a role in signaling the start of the hair cycle. However, with EGF, it has both stimulating and inhibiting effects on hair growth. In fact, too much EGF has been shown to arrest follicular development in transgenic mice. Worse than that, though, it's been hypothesized that too much EGF might even be a cause of alopecia areata. That's because subjects with alopecia areata were found to have increased levels of EGF compared to normal subjects. So, I think it's important to realize that the amount of these growth factors that trigger the start and the end of the hair growth cycle is finely tuned by the body, and too much of them might actually have negative effects. So of the other ingredients in the serum, Bryan Johnson includes caffeine in all of his products, including his custom serum that isn't for sale, and it's even found in his shampoo too. I did a video on caffeine as a treatment for hair loss several years ago, and I'll link that video below. I haven't seen any new research since I did that video, but the use of topical caffeine for hair loss is mostly based on this study that compared a 0.2% caffeine solution to 5% topical minoxidil. The 2 treatments were tested in 210 men with androgenetic alopecia over a period of 6 months. The men were randomized to receive either treatment, but one flaw of the study was that it was an open-label study, meaning neither the subjects nor the investigators were blinded as to which subjects got which treatment. That's a shame, because a study like that would be very easy to make double-blinded. Also, the study used trichograms, but the primary endpoint was the percentage of hairs in the androgen growth phase of the hair cycle. Obviously, having more hairs in the androgen growth phase is a good thing, because that means there are more hairs actively growing, but they didn't measure other parameters that you can measure with a hair trichogram, like hair counts and hair thickness. These are parameters that most hair treatment studies will actually measure. So, the study showed both caffeine and minoxidil increased the percentage of androgen hairs by a similar margin. The investigators concluded that both treatments were equally good at growing hair, but like I pointed out, there were flaws to the study. Another problem is that the senior author was an employee of the company making the caffeine preparation. So I could see why Bryan Johnson adds caffeine to his hair serum and shampoo, but it would be nice if there were more studies to confirm that caffeine really is an effective treatment for hair loss. Another major ingredient in the serum is copper tripeptide 1. I did a video on copper peptides about 3 years ago that I'll link below, but it turns out there isn't a lot of new research on copper peptides since then. Copper tripeptides are naturally occurring substances in the body. There are a set of 3 amino acids that bind to copper. The most common copper tripeptide is called GHKCU. Copper tripeptides have been found in mouse studies to be useful for wound healing, but it was also found that there was an enlargement of hair follicles around the edges of the wounds when copper tripeptides were used. But you know what they say, right? Everything grows hair on mice. So the next step was to look at the effect of copper peptides on cultured human hair follicles, which was done in this study right here. The study showed increased hair growth in the cultured follicles at low concentrations of the copper peptides, but then there was actually an inhibition of growth at higher concentrations. So there have been just a few studies in humans that I could actually find. This study here used the GHK peptide without copper and combined it with an amino acid that isn't found in proteins called 5-ALA to form a compound called Allovax. The study was done in 45 subjects with androgenetic alopecia, and the subjects received either Allovax at 100 milligrams per milliliter or 50 milligrams per milliliter, or they got a placebo. The study showed that there was a statistically significant increase in hair counts versus the placebo group only with the 50 milligram dose of Allovax. So this isn't a very strong study. There's another small study of just 6 subjects that received copper peptides along with an herbal extract that supposedly showed improved hair growth, but it's hard to make anything out of such a small study. Here's another small study of 7 subjects who had scalp tattooing with minoxidil, dutasteride, and copper peptides where there was clearly improved hair growth, but of course it's impossible to tell if the copper peptides added anything to the minoxidil and dutasteride effects. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that while there is some basic research suggesting copper tripeptides might be useful, there isn't a lot of human clinical data. But since Bryan Johnson will pretty much add anything to his products when there is even the slightest bit of positive data, that's probably why copper peptide 1 is in his serum. Finally in the serum, we have curcumin and menthol. As far as I can tell, there's only sparse basic research on curcumin being an antioxidant and also possibly being a weak 5-AR inhibitor. There are no robust randomized clinical trials of either substance showing they're effective in treating hair loss in humans. That's true of all the other substances in this complete list of ingredients in the serum. He mentions substances like adenosine, vitamin C, and nicotinamide, as well as some others, and these all have some theoretical benefits as growth stimulants, but it's not at all clear what the amounts are in the serum and whether these amounts would be enough to really give any noticeable benefit. So Bryan Johnson doesn't actually make any hair growth claims for his hair serum, which is good because I don't think he could probably back up any claims like that. The Bryan Johnson approach to hair growth, much like his approach to longevity, is to throw the entire kitchen sink at the problem. Essentially, anything that might even theoretically be helpful for hair growth, he just throws it into serum and he hopes it will help. And you know, maybe that works for him. But personally, I'd save your money and just go with the budget option, which is 5% minoxidil. I doubt all the extra stuff in his serum and his shampoo is doing much, and any little benefit it provides probably isn't worth all the extra money. Also, I'm curious as to why he doesn't actually sell his custom serum. You know, the one containing minoxidil and dutasteride on his website. I mean, maybe that's coming up soon, and when it does, I'm sure it's going to be very expensive. So I will admit that Bryan Johnson's hair loss routine is at least interesting. I mean, if he just used oral finasteride and topical minoxidil, then nobody would care since everybody already knows that those products work. But I think Bryan Johnson should still strongly consider taking a closer look at finasteride's great longevity benefits, especially in regards to cardiovascular health. I think for someone as obsessed with longevity as Bryan Johnson is, it is a real missed opportunity for him to ignore such a beneficial and life-extending drug. And I've talked about that in many of my other Bryan Johnson videos already, so make sure you check out my Bryan Johnson playlist link below if you haven't seen it yet. Alright, Jooms, the fight to defeat the slaphead curse is far from over, so I'll see you all again very soon. Thank you for watching, God bless.